We will now explore long-term economic growth versus short-term economic fluctuations by assessing Keynesian, monetarist, and neoclassical ideas. We will visually examine the short-term and long-term shifts and movements of Keynesian, monetarist, and neoclassical economic models. Let's look at short-term and long-term economic growth under the monetarist and neoclassical theories. Figure 1 depicts short-term economic growth in the monetarist and neoclassical models. Let's use an illustration to demonstrate short-term economic growth. The horizontal line depicts real GDP, or GDPR, and the vertical line represents the general price level. Draw the aggregate demand curve, AD, and the short-run aggregate supply curve, SIS. The long-run aggregate supply curve, LIS, should then be displayed alongside real GDP, GDPR, or real income, YR. According to monetarist and neoclassical theories, short-term economic growth can be generated by increases in aggregate demand, which shift the aggregate demand curve, AD, to the right, causing real GDP to rise. Short-term aggregate economic growth can also be fueled by rises in the short-run aggregate supply curve, SIS. The SIS's rightward shift will enhance real GDP. The key argument here is that short-term economic expansion has no effect on the increase in potential output. As a result, there is no rightward shift in the long-run aggregate supply curve, LIS. Now let's look at long-term economic growth under the monetarist and neoclassical models. Figure 1 depicts how macroeconomic equilibrium evolves over time as potential output increases. Over long periods of time, most economies see favorable economic growth. As a result, the long-term growth trend shifts potential output to the right, shifting the long-run aggregate supply curve, LIS, along with the aggregate demand curve, AD, and short-run aggregate supply curve, SIS. Remember that long-term economic growth in the business cycle and in the monetarist and neoclassical models raises potential output and causes the long-run aggregate supply curve, LIS, to shift to the right. Figure 2 explains both short and long-term Keynesian economic growth. As usual, the x-axis shows real GDP, or GDPR, while the y-axis represents the general price level. Draw the reversed, L-shaped Keynesian aggregate supply curve, AS, and aggregate demand curve, AD, using YR as the real income, or real GDP. In the Keynesian model, short-term economic growth occurs when the aggregate demand curve, AD, shifts along the aggregate supply curve, AS, resulting in increased real GDP. Again, in the short term, economic growth does not result in a rise in potential output, therefore, there is no rightward shift in the aggregate supply curve, AS. Long-term economic growth under the Keynesian model, like the monetarist and neoclassical models, will result in a rightward shift in the aggregate supply curve, AS, as well as the aggregate demand curve, AD. In the actual world, it is extremely difficult to observe economic activity and draw precise judgments about how much of the growth is due to short-term volatility and how much is due to growth in potential output induced by the causes mentioned above. However, economists are constantly working to estimate potential output and growth, as knowing estimates of these can help governments create suitable policies to steer the macroeconomy in the right direction.